So hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to our event from New York to Camden, the High Line Effect. My name is Christoph Lindner, and I'm delighted to welcome everybody. And this is for us quite an exciting moment because we are live in the Bloomsbury Theatre studio, but we're also online. So it's a real hybrid event with people joining us in person and virtually, and that's a lot of the fun of what we're going to try to do today. So this event is about exploring the Camden Highline, and we are recording this for our YouTube channel, just so you're aware that this is being recorded live. But this is an event that is about exploring the Camden Highline, a new park in the sky, which is coming to London. And this event is also part of a whole week of exciting events that have been part of the Bartlett Together Festival. And it also is the finale of the first series of UCL's Future Cities podcast. So this is a podcast that takes a deep dive into the challenges of urban living. So we are doing a lot of things right now: live event, in-person event, remote event, podcast recording, and a group conversation about the Camden Highline. So as I mentioned, my name is Christoph Lindner. I'm the Dean of the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment here at University College London. And one of the reasons I'm really excited to be hosting our discussion today is because a few years back, I published a book about the New York High Line called Deconstructing the High Line. And at the time that we went to press, the Camden High Line had not yet come into being in the way that we'll talk about today. So this book misses out the Camden High Line, but it engages with a lot of the things that I think the Camden High Line is all about. And in this book, which is a collection of essays by lots of different authors, what we try to do is understand why there has been this phenomenon, the phenomenon of the elevated park, the phenomenon of transforming abandoned or neglected urban infrastructure into new public green space. New York is just one of the cities in the world where this has happened. It was also not the first city in the world where it's happened. And the popularity of the New York High Line, however, has unleashed something of a phenomenon worldwide where many different cities are exploring ways of creating their own more localized versions of a High Line park. And so Camden High Line falls into that. In the book itself, we call this the High Line effect. And that's a little bit what we're going to be talking about today. And since this is a recording of the podcast series, Future Cities, I just wanted to say one or two words about what that's about. This is a podcast series that began back in May 2021, and it explores the challenges of urban living. And as we know, those challenges are many. Throughout the series, we've examined how technology, climate change, health, and society all interconnect in our cities, and London especially. And we've also explored how the spaces of tomorrow are being shaped. So the podcast series has been a great success. It's engaged people from all across the world, and I'm really happy. It's a real pleasure to be able to come together in this space at the Bloomsbury Theatre studio for the series finale, and to do so by discussing a new addition to our city here in London, the Camden High Line. So I want to start by introducing our guest speakers, and then what we're going to do is open up to the discussion with our guests about how the High Line effect might shape the future of Camden, and whether things like tourism, gentrification, and investment might benefit the community. And we're also going to make time for a Q&A with our audience after the discussion. And so if you're joining us online, you'll be able to submit your questions via the Zoom chat. And there'll be instructions in the chat on how to do that. And if you're in the room with us today, we'll also be using a microphone to pick up your questions. So let's meet our guests. And we have two fantastic guests with us today. One of our guests is able to join us in the studio, and our other guest is joining us remotely online. It was initially the plan that she would be here with us in the studio, but as we know, in the age of pandemic planning, plans have to change and adapt, and we're just rolling with it. So I'm joined by Simon Pittkiefly, who is the CEO of the Business Improvement Districts Camden Town Unlimited and Euston Town, and also the CEO of Camden Collective and, very importantly for us, the Camden Highline. He is also the co-chair of the Cross River Partnership and chair of Camden Giving. And Simon has been leading the Camden Highline project since its inception in 2017. So great to have you with us, Simon. And then we're joined remotely by Jodie Eastwood, and really excited, Jodie, that you could make it. She is the CEO of London's Knowledge Quarter, which is a consortium of knowledge creators, all within a 1 mile radius of King's Cross. And the aim of the Knowledge Quarter is to encourage all kinds of knowledge seekers to make the most of the partners' combined resources. So to break down barriers and stimulate dialogue, to create new friendships, new connections, and new knowledge through a sense of shared purpose and possibility. And here at UCL, we are located within and contribute to the Knowledge Quarter. So I'll turn things over to our speakers, and I'd like to invite them to tell us just a little bit more about their background and also their involvement in the Camden Highline project. And I think we'll begin with you, Simon. Could you tell us what is the Camden Highline and what is your role in the project?
Gladly. Thank you, Christoph. Thanks very much for having me. So yeah, I run the Camden Highline project. I'm its proposer, and I'm responsible for making sure it happens and raising the money. I think for those who don't know, the Camden Highline is going to be an amazing park in the sky that'll run from Camden Town to the back of King's Cross. It's about 1.2 kilometers long. It's going to have 4 entrance points, although the design team are now trying to squeeze in a 5th. Don't they always? Design creep. They don't have to pay for it, that's why. But the fundamentals of it are much like New York or Paris. And let's not forget that the Promenade Plantée was there first. The French got there first, a bit like America. It's also going to be next to a live train line. So it's up on the viaduct and there's going to be trains going past you. And I always like to say there's something really, when you do get up there, it's quite difficult to go up there at the moment because of the live trains. There's really something quite magical about having trains trundle past you, both passenger trains and freight trains. And I think that's what's going to make it particularly stand out as a sort of Highline raised park initiative. That's probably enough for now. Bit of scene setting. Is that okay, Christoph?
Yeah, that sounds great. And I'm really glad that you already referenced the Promenade Plantée in Paris, which was a disused rail viaduct that was turned into a linear park back in the early 90s, I believe. And that's really an interesting and important reference point for this whole phenomenon of elevated parks. But also fascinating to hear that a key difference of the Camden Highline is that there will be a live railway. So trains will be going past you. And that is completely different to Paris, where it is a disused railway line with no trains going by, and the same in New York, disused rail line with no trains going by. So that's something we have to come back to. What will that be like being up there with trains hurtling past? But Jodie, let's invite you in, and we'd love just to hear a little bit more about your work, about the Knowledge Quarter, and how that connects to the Camden Highline.
Thank you, Christoph, and it's lovely to be here, although as a slightly detached head on a table for those in the studio audience. So the Knowledge Quarter, as Christoph pointed out, is a geographical area, a loose 1 mile radius from King's Cross Station, and is considered one of the world's largest innovation districts. Within the KQ, you can find knowledge resources ranging from, the world's earliest books at the British Museum to the latest fashion and creative designs and cutting edge medical research. So, befitting to the work that we do and the way that we operate, the KQ kind of came around from a conversation between neighbours. And the heads of the British Library, the Crick, and Central St Martin's University Arts London began to talk what it meant to have one of the world's largest libraries next to Europe's largest medical research institute and one of the world's most renowned art and design schools. 3 incredibly different organisations, but at heart of everything they do is the creation and sharing of knowledge. And the more that they looked at the King's Cross Bloomsbury area, the more they began to understand that neighbours weren't talking to neighbours and opportunities for collaboration and innovation and friendship were being lost. So the partnership brought what currently sits as around 100 organisations together to really begin to consider what makes place and how people within that place can begin to work with each other in a much more strategic and effective way. It's worth mentioning that the origin of the Knowledge Quarter is very unlike most innovation districts. So most innovation districts are built by governments, landowners and developers to drive inward investment. But where you're sitting at the moment, Bloomsbury's been the intellectual heart of London for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so for us, it was about bringing people together, considering those that had been there before some of the larger developments in the King's Cross area, and how we engage with both businesses, but also the communities that have circulated or populated desirable land redevelopment. So, we're collectively responsible to ensure that our innovation district not only responds to the needs of the business community, but also connects deeply with its citizens, building spaces and housing businesses that offer community benefits, whether that be green space or employment and education opportunities. And this is where the High Line is so important for us. You have this new and innovative and bustling part of the city. But sometimes the connections aren't there. People find it difficult to move around these spaces. So beginning to develop a walk, a park in the sky, a new piece of regeneration, urban development that can begin to connect these innovative places is really, really important to us. And we hope that it will go somewhat towards kind of consolidating what we would see as a spatial strategy for the Knowledge Quarter area.
Thank you for sharing that, Jodie. And you've already touched on one of the first things I wanted to ask you and Simon, which is the question, why would a park like the Camden Highline be good for London? Why do we even need it? And you, Jodie, have referenced the importance of kind of consolidating community relations and neighborliness and thinking about what positive things make a place into a place. And it sounds like the Camden Highline could contribute to those things. But more broadly, London is often considered quite a green city. We had recently, I think it's fair to call it this now, the debacle of the Garden Bridge, that very expensive non-bridge, non-park that never got built over the Thames. And so I think we could ask the question, do we need a park in the sky? What do you think, Simon?
I think, I love to be able to say that we could build the Camden Highline for less than they spent not building the Garden Bridge. It's one of my favorite little quotes. So I think, you could argue the merits of the Garden Bridge, and I don't think they were all bad, actually, I have to say. But one of the key things I think we've already realized with the Camden Highline is that because of its proximity to the 4 housing estates in Camden, and the lack of green in and around those areas, the Mayor of London's aspiration that everyone should be within 400 meters of green space, 10,000 people qualify for that the minute you open the High Line, just because of the lack of green space around there, but also because of the density of those housing estates. If you go to 500 meters, it's 20,000 people, which is something like 8% of Camden's population. So just on those metrics alone, it's kind of worth doing.
Yeah.
I think it's also there's something really interesting happening to London as a whole, which is perhaps more about the economic positioning. But if you look at a visitor economy map of London circa 1980, there was a sort of Camden Town bit popping out the top. You then got the sort of South Bank coming in more into the central visitor economy area when we opened the Jubilee line and Waterloo International. King's Cross has just pulled a chunk out of the top of that kind of area. Euston's going to do the same, obviously, with HS2. But the High Line kind of pulls that all together. You join up Camden Town and King's Cross in a way that when you start to think about London as an economic area, central London, actually it changes quite a lot, and the High Line becomes quite an important boundary there. So I think at both ends of the economic spectrum, you can justify it. Never mind all the sort of biodiversity points and land value increases and so on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I like this idea of the High Line as a kind of link between different neighborhoods in and around Camden. And it makes me wonder about the name. So in New York, it's called the New York High Line, not the Manhattan High Line or the West Side High Line. Is there any history or politics to why it's the Camden High Line and not the London High Line?
I think there's an element of Camden has a very strong international brand and of its own. Mm-hmm. People kind of know Camden in a sense, and I think it is a very sort of Camden-centric kind of thing. You know, we run the business improvement district for Camden Town, and so it's always very much grown out of that. But I don't think the name has to be set in stone. I mean, it's been a useful working title because Camden and High Line, kind of, you get it. It explains it very well and easily. Lots of people know about New York. We make it as one word. They have it as two words. But you know, so I think it's been useful. I'm not completely wedded to it, as I often say to the community groups that we speak to, and I've spoken to loads and loads of them. You know, one day we might have to call this the Smirnoff High Line in order to be able to attract the commercial sponsorship to build it, which doesn't always go down well.
I was just about to say.
You know, there's lots of variations on that. But I think I do think there is something about the name Camden that's quite unusual, and you know, London isn't not like New York in that way. You know, those sort of low. I mean, we've got 23 boroughs and New York's only got 5. You know, sometimes I wish we were more like New York in that way. But it's a different place, and I think, like as I say, the brand Camden is quite important actually, and quite useful.
Okay. And so I'm also wondering then, the particular moment that we're in, why now, as we work through a pandemic and hopefully find a way out of that pandemic, why would a space like an elevated park adjacent to a live railway, why is that something that we need? And I'm wondering, from the point of view, Jodie, from the kind of knowledge quarter point of view, a community relations point of view, do you see an increased urgency now for a project like the Camden High Line?
Yes, I mean, you know, we always talk of the knowledge culture in the sense of an embarrassment of riches, and the density that it serves. I mean, you know, King's Cross, Camden, the knowledge culture area is probably one of the most overdeveloped places in London, if not in Europe. What we see is a lack of space for commercial development, and obviously as the knowledge culture, we want to support the right types of businesses moving into the area that offer added value into the knowledge economy through life sciences, AI, machine learning, and all of that wonderful stuff. But what that means is that you lose, or local authorities begin to kind of reclaim that green space, which is absolutely vitally important to make any kind of part of any city work effectively. So yeah, within New York, within Paris, probably a huge amount more space available in which to be able to deliver these types of projects. But in London and in the knowledge culture, there isn't. So to be able to take something that is disused, that has that level of connectivity between parts of the area, is vitally connected into the local community, but also the business community as well, and then present it as a great place for people to socialize, for people to be in, for people to populate, is really, really important, particularly with the HS2 development taking away some of the green space that we see in and around the area at the moment.
So then let's talk a little bit about the imagined experience of the High Line. So we've touched on some of its values, why it makes sense in the location, but also in this moment. But we also know that there are going to be these trains hurtling by Is that going to be loud and scary? Is that going to be relaxing? How, Simon, do you imagine an everyday stroll along the Camden High Line unfolding?
Well, it's very interesting you say that in terms of the trains going past and it being noisy. It's surprisingly not noisy at all.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really quite serene place to be. The trains are speed limited. So I'm looking up because we've got a video of it going on, and you might see a train go past at some point. But it's a surprisingly serene place to be, and the trains are speed limited because it's on a viaduct. So they're not hurtling past you at all.
Okay.
They make quite kind of clunky, cute train noises, I think. And for me, as I always like to say, because I've been up there, it is a restricted area. You can't go without a lot of Network Rail support. You're seeing trains sort of just doing their thing when they're not at platforms is quite unusual. I expect trains to be the size they are when I get on them, but of course they've got wheels and bits underneath, and so it's quite a surreal experience in that way. And particularly those freight trains that just seem to go on and on and on and on. It's really quite nice. So I'm hoping that we're going to be able to find a way of separating the two, where you can still see and hear and feel the trains as they go past you. Like I say, it's not like an intercity train. It's much cuter than that. In terms of the sort of experience that you're going to be able to meander through a relatively quick, direct route between Camden Town and King's Cross, through what we hope will be amazing greenery, some stimulating environments. There's going to be some sort of event type spaces. I mean, we're still designing it with James Corner and Field Operations at the moment. Actually, they're designing it. I'm not doing anything to design it. But I think we want it to be amazing. We want it to stay amazing. We want it to kind of be a little experience in its own right, but also to be very practical. Yeah. Because I think, on Jodie's point, we do, people like me who run business improvement districts, we spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about town centres. It's our day job. And I think it's quite interesting, by the way, that business improvement districts don't use themselves to do more things like generate High Lines or our other project, Camden Collective, because I think it's such a great model. All of your staff are already paid for. You've got the infrastructure. And I think that's been quite an interesting feature of how we've got the High Line as far as we have, as quick as we have. But I think the way in which town centres link to each other, if you think of Camden Town, King's Cross and Euston, they don't really interact with each other very much at all. And they don't really think that much about the communities around them. I know we all like to think we do, but in reality, do we? So I think things that kind of bring those chunky economic areas together, link them together, but also make them relevant to the people around them. And of course, post-pandemic, 15-minute city, all of that stuff, suddenly it becomes a lot more interesting than it was before. And it was pretty interesting before the pandemic.
Yeah. So you mentioned James Corner and Field Operations, who are going to design the Camden High Line, and very famously are also behind the design for the New York High Line.
Yeah.
And for me, it raises a question. Why use the same designers for this park, given that it further references or ties this project back to New York? So I'm just wondering whether there's discussion or tension within the broader project around the degree to which you're comfortable being similar or referencing the New York High Line, and the degree to which you want to be different and separate from it.
Yeah, James hates the fact that we call it the High Line, by the way. He loves to call it something different because he's very conscious of that connection. Yeah. I mean, just for background, we ran an international design competition. We had 75 entries, and they all put together teams of people. It's not just James and Field Operations who are doing this. In fact, one of the entries included the musician Brian Eno, and they didn't get shortlisted. I'm still upset about that. I think that we really should have had Brian Eno, whatever team he was in. But that was a very eminent team of judges, looked at all the entries, and they, which I wasn't involved in, they chose James and his team because of the team, really. It wasn't that much to do with New York. It was to do with people like Pierre Oldorf, people like VPPR, who are a local architecture practice based in Kentish Town. It's a really cute, interesting team they've put together, and I think that was the winning combination, actually. It wasn't just the ideas and the approach. It doesn't hurt that James has done it before, but we certainly didn't think that we'd end up where we did. It was very much a kind of open design competition.
Okay, good to hear. And New York is on my mind because
there's a song there.
now that it's been a while, a decade or so since the New York High Line has been open, we've seen its effects on the surrounding neighborhood. It's matured as a park. It's worked through some of its teething issues. And I think we've also learned a bit from New York. And I'm wondering, is there anything you've observed in the New York version of the elevated park that you want to avoid in the Camden version?
I've had several meetings with the originators of the New York High Line, and I've asked them the obvious question: what would you do now, knowing what you know, if you were us? And they all said two things. They said, one, get the landowners to contribute because they're the biggest beneficiaries and they contributed the least. And the second is build the community in from the start. Let them be part of the evolution of this thing as it happens. And that's been something that we've really tried hard from the beginning. We've had 1,500 people go on walks. We've got 300 friends of the High Line. We've got 1,000 donations already. We've really spent a lot of shoe leather trying to kind of help people understand that. And indeed, one of James Corner's team is specifically involved in that engagement with those housing estates that perhaps are less interested in things like the High Line. They haven't been to New York. They don't necessarily get that, and it's a bit too far away. They have more immediate concerns. I mean, far away in time. So I think we've really picked that up with gusto from what they told us. But I also think it will naturally be different because of the train, because of where it is. I think Camden Town and King's Cross are their own identities, and I suspect they'll infect the High Line from each end in different ways. And I think that'll be really interesting. How it pans out, we don't know, but it's fascinating to watch how it's evolving already.
So you mentioned housing around the Camden High Line, and I think this is an important but also sensitive topic. And if I look back to the New York High Line, one of the effects of creating that park was to unleash waves of rapid, intense gentrification on the west side of Manhattan, and to cause real estate values to just skyrocket. And some even argue that the New York High Line killed off the art scene in Chelsea and other parts of Manhattan because of the gentrification effects. And so, Jodie, I'm thinking from a Knowledge Quarter point of view, what worries do you have around the potential of the Camden High Line to unleash similarly kind of uncontrolled gentrification?
I mean, I think we can appreciate that central London is already an incredibly expensive place to live, regardless of whether it's in Camden or not. I think that what Simon says is very appropriate. Camden is a very, very different place to New York, and therefore will respond to this in different ways. I think one of my worries has always been how to ensure that the communities are built into the conversation around the High Line from the beginning, which has been done. The gentrification or regeneration, however you want to kind of talk about it, is evident within King's Cross already, quite significantly. And I think that the words that I would use and the words that I would take through into the continued development of the High Line is it for us? What we hear from our local communities is this is not for us. We do not belong on this development. The shops that have been commissioned to be here are not affordable. This isn't for us. So in order for it to be successful, it needs to be for the community and for everybody. I think my only other one concern, and this is probably something that I would challenge Network Rail and Simon and the bid team to consider, is the length of lease on this. I would like to see a much longer lease available to Camden High Line than is currently available, and I think that would make the long-term investment, considering that with the Euston development you're looking at 40 plus years worth of development. I think that it would be good to see an equal, if not increased, lease for the High Line itself as well.
Shall I jump in? Yeah, I mean, can you tell Network Rail that, Jodie?
Yeah, I will do.
They work in their 30-year cycles, and so we have to kind of think about that. To be honest, if we had started on that foot, we'd never have got anywhere with Network Rail. It's all about We've always talked about temporary. We use our other project, Camden Collective, which is all about meanwhile space, as an example of us using other people's assets well, and you know, not embarrassing the owners and so on. And we've had to do quite an important piece of work in helping Network Rail work with us, who actually have been really, really good, far better than people expect Network Rail to be about these sorts of projects. They've actually been great. So you know, some things are, the Eiffel Tower is temporary. You know, I think these things, you work with a grain of where you're going and hope that they kind of last longer. And, you know, that's part, again, I think as a business improvement district, we can take those sorts of risks in a way that a university might not, you know, you kind of, or certainly local authorities and so on. So I think there's lots of things there. The other thing, just back to the point about gentrification, which is different about the Camden High Line, is that these 4 housing estates that it goes through are owned by the local authority. So yes, you're going to get land value increases at the Argent Estate, at Tile Yard, at Camden Market, and to lots of HONOs in around Kentish Town. But actually the majority of the space is cutting right through Camden-owned housing estates. Now, Camden may get an increase in its balance sheet value as a result of that, but it can't do much with it as a local authority. So you've got that inbuilt kind of downward pressure, which sometimes I regret, because it'd be nice to try and, you know, find ways of utilizing that to raise the finance. So again, I think we're very mindful of that effect. And I think, as to Jodie's point, there's a limit to what you can do about progress, which isn't quite what Jodie said, but I'm sort of paraphrasing. But I also think that because of that connection to the ownership by the local authority, by the public sector, I think it is quite different. The other interesting thing that we didn't think about at all when we first started it is that when you're at King's Cross, that bit on York Way, you're going to be a 10-minute walk from the Camden Road Overground station. Now, at the moment, if you're down there, you don't think the Overground's anywhere near you. And I think those sorts of things, and it's a direct interface that you're going to have with the platform, the eastbound platform, those sorts of things, I think, really help make it practical and useful to people who live very nearby, so that it's not just, oh, a kind of nice park, much as it might be, and it will be free. And of course, that's, you know, what it costs to build has got no reflection of how much it's going to cost to be up there, because it won't cost you anything. But if it's practical and it's useful for your everyday, it connects you, I think, much more to it than something that's just a place to visit because it's nice.
Yeah. So we're going to start moving towards our audience questions in a little while. So if you want to start thinking about any questions for our guests, now is a good time to do it. And you can even start typing them into the chat so that we can pick those up. But before we get to that, I would like to touch on the extent or the ways in which the park will be a public space. And again, with New York as a reference point, one of the criticisms directed at the New York park is, yes, technically it's public, but the public funding of that park has come at the cost of supporting other parks in other parts of the city that have been kind of neglected and underfunded and under-resourced for a long time. So it's activated a kind of parks inequity dynamic within New York City. But maybe also importantly, that the New York High Line, yes, it's a public park, but it's not a very free space. You have tightly controlled access. You can only, you know, walk in certain ways. You can't play sports. You can't do messy things. You can only purchase stuff from approved vendors in approved places. And you do have that critique that the park is almost like a curated landscape museum experience / a backyard for billionaires kind of critique. Now, that is one extreme, and it's hard to imagine the Camden High Line being quite at that extreme, but it does raise the question of, in what ways will the experience of the park feel free, open, public?
Shall I go?
Go for it, Simon.
Yeah, you won't been Camden Town, have you? I don't think it's going to be like that, really. In terms, I think that a lot of the grittiness of Camden Town will, as I say, infect the High Line. I think there's also the difference in to your first point, the difference in the model of public park funding in this country compared to New York is, I think, important here. So we're not taking resource away from the parks team at Camden Council to build or run the park. That's the whole point, is it's a self-contained entity. So whether either the council-run parks or the royal parks, you know, deteriorate or improve, won't be connected to whether the High Line does well, because we're raising money in our own way that's different to their funding streams. But I think back to my earlier point in terms of whether it will become a billionaire's playing ground, the places it connects to aren't so much that, but also because of the practical connections. It will be a much better way of getting between Camden Town and King's Cross than any existing route. Even the canal is A, very narrow, B, dominated by cyclists, and C, not very direct. So I think, again, that the practicality of it matters quite a lot, I think, when you compare it to New York.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and how the local specificities and histories and cultures and the urban geography of Camden will make things different. And I'd love then to turn to one of our Zoom questions, because it continues to push us down this line of thinking. And we have one of our audience members online asking us about whether this elevated park might create shadowed, dull, dingy spaces below it. So in other words, what's going to happen underneath the park? And I'm sure that you've thought of that, but I'm also wondering, Jodie, from a Knowledge Quarter kind of business development point of view, does space under the park represent something of an opportunity?
I mean, this is not being built from scratch. So these places and spaces already exist. Obviously, it represents an opportunity. I mean, any available space within the Knowledge Quarter area that isn't occupied provides an opportunity. We have companies from across the UK, across Europe, and across the world that are looking to position themselves in the innovation district that is the Knowledge Quarter in King's Cross. So yeah, I mean, it obviously provides an interesting opportunity for us. But I think that, sort of going back to the community benefits and thinking about, the work that perhaps has not been done so well in Brixton with the Brixton Archers, how could these spaces be used in a meanwhile capacity, which Simon has a lot of expertise on, to continue the economic investment and growth for those people in the local community.
So then, Simon, what's your view of the space below, around the High Line?
I think Jodie's put it very well, really. I mean, because we're not building anything new, the space below it is already there, and a lot of it is quite dull. What we'll be doing is putting feet into it to actually bring them to life in a way that they currently aren't. Those people that go around on the walks under the High Line now are spending a lot of time in quite dull, disused spaces. I think we're going to bring quite a lot of light and vibrancy to them. Unlike the Garden Bridge, we're reusing what's already there, not starting something from scratch. Yeah.
So do you imagine that this vision of a park in the sky for London might catch on in other cities in the UK?
Oh, I think it already is, isn't it? I mean, it's it's all over the place. I think forever getting reproaches from people in Manchester and Birmingham and other countries as well. So tell us what you know. How can we learn?
Okay.
So I'll tell you when I've built it. Just leave me.
So if members of the audience have any questions they would like to ask, you're very free to do so. Just raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. But meanwhile, we have lots and lots of questions coming in online. So I want to begin to pick up some of those. Connecting back to the question about the ways in which the park will be public and accessible, we've got a very practical question here asking whether there will be elevators or stairs or some kind of vertical transportation to ensure accessibility.
Yeah. I mean, we wouldn't get planning permission from Camden if it weren't fully accessible. Yeah, absolutely right. So every access point will have both stairs and lift. Yeah. No, that's built in from the start. Yeah. Interestingly, one interesting piece of feedback from the guys in New York is make sure your lifts are big enough. And I said, well, does it really matter that much? We have to get snowplows up and down all the time, and it's an absolute nightmare. So make sure we probably don't have that problem in London.
Yeah, that should happen only once every decade.
Yeah, that's right. And we won't be able to cope anyway, so we need to snowplow.
And another design-related question is asking whether the Camden High Line will, like the New York High Line, have different kinds of spaces to kind of linger and lounge, like overlooks, seating areas. What kind of variety do you anticipate across the linear park? I
think the way the design's going at the moment is quite interesting. They're sort of seeing it as 4 sections, each of which having its own character. So there'll be a kind of wild area. There will be the overlooks that you talk about. I think we're also quite interested in, from a ground level perspective, trying to find as many ways as possible for the High Line to kind of overflow. So at least it's sort of present in your line of sight, even though it's quite a long way up, it's present in your line of sight. So yeah, I think there's going to be different experiences as you go along it for exactly that reason. And in terms of accessibility as also, you know, we've always maintained the idea that it has to be, even if we've got an event up there, it still has to be a linear park that people can walk through, even if they can't go to the bit where there's an event. And I think that's, again, slightly different to New York. Ask me again when I have to do that to pay for it. But, you know, one of the things that, again, we've learned from New York is what we're trying to do is not just raise the money to build it, but raise the money for an endowment to maintain it. So we want it to be amazing, and we want it to stay amazing. So I think we've tried to think through all those things, but, you know, we won't get everything right for sure.
Okay, and another question. This one I'll direct to Jodie in the first instance, but it's about Camden's brand image. So we have an audience member wondering or saying that Camden's brand image is one of creativity and quirks, and is wondering whether that will be reflected in the High Line's design and functionality. And Jodie, I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit on how you perceive Camden's image at the moment, and if you have thoughts on how the High Line project might change it or reinforce it.
I mean, Camden's a wonderful borough. It's always been considered a borough of, I think the local authorities say, rebellious spirit, and I think that sums Camden up very well. It's also an incredibly large borough, and I think that maybe don't appreciate just quite how big it is. For me, it's about being innovative and taking risks, and I think that that's where the High Line provides that really interesting point of exploration into what it means to create space and what it means to create space within an already very populated area. And I think that Simon mentioned about the Regent's Canal as a connecting walk through the Knowledge Quarter, through Camden. But if you look at how popular that's become and how congested that's become, then it shows that there's an evident need for an alternative. So I think that, you know, how it's delivered will be reflected in the spirit that Camden has. If it's innovative, if it's risk-taking, if it goes sort of above and beyond just what a walk in the sky would look like, and does those things that Simon was talking about, sort of, you know, coming over the edges and feeding into the public realm and environment around it, then it will fit very beautifully into the spirit of the area.
It's interesting when you talk to people at the local authority of Camden. For people who don't know the area, if you say you work at Camden Council, they think you've got an office in Camden Lock. And that bit of Camden High Street is very much what people think of as the whole borough. As Jodie said, it's a much bigger, more complex place than just that. But I think one of the things that we've always recognized is that as land values increase in an area like Camden Town in particular, you do lose. You know, when I was a young man, you came to Camden, you set up a business because it was cheap. And everyone else around was doing the same thing. It was fun, you know. And we are losing some of that as land values increase, and that's happening in cities across the world, and particularly in London. And one of the reasons we set up Camden Collective, my colleague Lauren's in the audience here, who was very much involved in that, is to try and make sure that we could get Camden Collective gives away free space to young creative startups. So people who wouldn't necessarily find themselves in a WeWork, but have got a great business idea, don't necessarily have the networks, we'll give them free space in order that they can have an opportunity to start their own venture, and hopefully see Camden Town as a place to do that, even though they couldn't initially have afforded to be there. So I think, I hope that sort of infection, you know, between the different things that we do through the business improvement districts will also help keep that spirit of Camden alive.
So that sounds like an approach that's quite different to how New York began the New York High Line. And it sounds like thinking about the needs of the community, the interests of the community is something that you've put very front and center. And Jodie, it sounds like from your point of view, from a Knowledge Quarter perspective, that's also going to be a huge part of what will make the Camden High Line successful. Let me test out a theory on you, because this is something I've been wondering for a while, and I don't know if this really works. But I think the Camden High Line will tell us if this is true. So the New York High Line has become the single most popular tourist destination in New York City. And I guess my theory is part of what's made it so popular and successful is that its presence has been producing its own view. And what I mean by that is the more popular it becomes, the more valuable the real estate, the more New York is able to kind of redevelop the area. And you have all these architects coming in, putting up amazing buildings or very expensive buildings or both at the same time. But it's a view, the cityscape that you're looking at is just constantly evolving, constantly changing. And the more popular the part gets, the more rapid that transformation. And that's very different to Paris, where the skyline that the Promenade Plantée cuts through is frozen. This is central Paris, it's historic, it's protected, it doesn't change, it will not change.
Yeah.
And so I wondered if the mutability of the New York skyline all around the High Line is part of what made it so popular. And I guess my question is, what's going to happen in Camden? Will this really interesting, edgy, urban skyline stay as it is? Are planning kind of regulations such that we will see a lot of change? What do you anticipate the area around the park looking like?
It's a very interesting question. And by the way, is that the topic of your next book? But I think it should.
It could be.
It should be. Look, Paris was effectively developed by the municipality, and Paris is a very controlled city in lots of ways. New York High Line was developed by a group of enthusiasts who very independent from the city. They actually started out by suing the city, you know, I mean, they were very independent from it. And so I think that's an important part of its character. And as I say, I think the fact that the Camden High Line is started by the Business Improvement District will also have a big effect on its character moving forward. So I think, and also you've got the depressing effect of the fact that the ownership is all in local authority hands in and around will stop that happening to a certain extent. And, you know, Lord knows anyone who tries to put up a building in London knows about viewing corridors. There are lots of things. So we're somewhere between the kind of free market of New York and the heavy control of Paris. How that plays out, I don't know. It was interesting talking to a developer who I won't name, but they reckon that there was a developer in New York who on the one hand was trying to sue the High Line to stop it extending because it was going over areas that they wanted to develop. And at the other end, they were using the High Line front and center in their marketing material for the flats they were trying to sell. So, you know, I think we don't know, but it's going to be interesting to watch. Great book.
Okay. And Jodie, do you have any thoughts on the mutability of the Camden skyline, the cityscape? I mean, how, if you could imagine the area around the Camden High Line 20, 50 years from now, what might be an ideal version of that for you? Would it look exactly the same? Would it be lined by massive skyscrapers with helicopter pads, something in between? What could the future look like for you?
And I think that we already have to recognise that as it stands at the moment, the King's Cross area is one of the most desirable places to set up a business, to house a very large organisation such as Google, who are building their headquarters in King's Cross at the moment. You know, this is not new for us. This has been a problem, a challenge, an issue for us for a number of years now, that space is just not available. And it's really about curating the right space. And I don't know if you know, but there's a policy. I'm not going to get into local authority planning policies at the moment because, you know, that's not on theme, but there is a policy that Camden use called for their site allocation plan, which asks that new developers look at very closely at what they're going to build and who it's going to be for. So it's about curating the right organizations. It's about ensuring that and I don't want to sort of start saying names, but rather than a big kind of faceless corporate bank moves in and takes a big skyscraper with a helicopter on top, what you get is you get a company or a business that's much more civically minded, that wants to contribute to the local economy, that believes in inclusive procurement, that believes in giving itself targets to employ from the local communities as well. And if those two things go hand in hand, then that offers up a really interesting opportunity for the community, for London and for the UK as well. It's all about interesting investment opportunities and how you benefit from those on a wider scale possible.
Okay, so a very different line of questioning to follow on from that. There's a whole arc of questions on the chat that are related to biodiversity and the environment. And if we go back to the initial points that we were discussing about bringing a green space into Camden. So obviously there's benefit for residents, there's benefit for quality of life, health, well-being. But how much of an impact will a park like the High Line actually have on the biodiversity of the area? Is it big enough to even have an impact?
I think it's one of the things we're thinking about quite a lot at the moment. I mean, there are areas of the High Line at the moment where if you were, wildlife living in the area, you'd find it quite difficult to cross. You can imagine that there. And in a sense, but there's also areas that are so dense because they're just grown wild because no one's been up there that you couldn't access them. And I'm hoping that what we're going to be able to do is sort of spread that out more evenly so that it becomes a useful thoroughfare for all kinds of biodiversity. But I think that it's part of the kind of post-pandemic world that we're starting to think a lot more seriously about now than we did 18 months ago. I think there's enough space up there because it gets to about 20 meters deep around Camden Road overground. So there's space enough to do a lot, but it is also in places just a very narrow strip of parkland, well, nothing at all at the moment. And I think it will, I hope that what we do is build all those thoughts in from the beginning and let it flourish in a way that will make it useful across all this, across that, for the whole biodiversity agenda. I mean, the other interesting thing, slightly off topic, but related to something you asked earlier, is as we talk to some of the people down at the estates at the eastern end, one of the things they keep asking is, can you scoop in more of the scrubland around there? So there's a certain amount of land that's specifically part of the Network Rail land, but there's also stuff that abuts the housing estates. Some of it used very well, some of it just scrubland. And they're saying, look, those are kind of hotbeds for antisocial behavior. Is there any way you could scoop them into the High Line, because then at least they'll be better managed? And that would also apply presumably to sort of biodiversity ideas as well.
Yeah, and on mentioning biodiversity, I think it brings up what I would, I guess, call the politics of planting. So there's been a lot of debate about what was planted in New York, how it was planted, who planted it. And we have some questions on the chat, just interested in what the approach to planting will be at the High Line and the extent to which it will look for native British plantings or take a different approach. Have you heard anything about that at this point?
We are very mindful of it, but I am absolutely not a planting expert, and I know this is quite a thorny minefield. I liken it to the sort of cycle debate. You kind of want to approach it with caution because there's lots of people who feel very strongly about it from one side or the other. But we've felt and have been encouraged by Camden, but also by the design team, that something that is sustainable in its own right, that's not going to require big kind of irrigation systems to maintain it, that is local. And because we do have to think about this temporary thing that, can exist within itself, is going to be really important to that. And I think Pierre Oldhoff is going to be quite an important part of that discussion.
So you brought up cycling, and there is a question
wanting
to know, will there be cycling on the High Line?
Oh my God, what did I let that? Okay,
I mean, if they're
the reason it's controversial is not because I have a view either way about cyclists really, but in all these kind of little conversations in the backs of pubs with sort of local community groups, there is, or when you take people on walks, there's always someone that says, can I take my bike up there? And 15 people turn to them and go, no! And it's because local people feel that the canal has been ruined for them by the cyclists. And they really have this strong sense that they quite like. Now, of course, the cycling lobby will say we should be able to go anywhere we like. And of course, we're not going to have police up there. There's no one's going to kind of, if you take your bike up there, I don't know, I don't know what the worst could happen is, but no one's going to kick you off the island. But I do think because there are some very narrow sections, so you couldn't have segregated cycling anyway. B, it's quite a long way to lug a bike up. It's not that close to the ground. And to go 1.2 kilometers in a straight line, once you know, and it probably, in bits of it, won't be a sort of straight line park either. So I think cyclists will be deterred rather than banned. And of course, Camden is doing a lot of work on improving cycle infrastructure on the ground level anyway. So yeah.
Yeah, and Jodie, the question of biodiversity and the greening of Camden, the High Line represents an intervention, a contribution to that larger effort. I know that right here at UCL, we have a whole active conversation going on about the possibility, which personally I'm very supportive of rewilding Bloomsbury. Do you have any thoughts if you could start to grow and open up new spaces for parks and rewilding and greening and restoring of habitats and increasing biodiversity, where could they go in the borough? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Wow, that's a great question. I think that more importantly than biodiversity, it's the diversity of use. And I think that that's really important to acknowledge and understand that communities that have been living in Camden have seen a decline in usable space. So, you know, we can look at some of the new developments and the planting is beautiful and it's all very exotic, but actually what people want is a lot of grass that they can sit on and run around on and have children, you know, be in the middle of nature. And I think that that's what we need to see more of. And I do get concerned because we see a lot of potential ideas for development that, you know, have roof gardens, and you know that's all fair and well for biodiversity, but then it becomes exclusive and local people can't access it. And you know what you're doing is you're dividing the equality of who has access to space and who has access to green space. So I think that that's an important. I wouldn't. You know, Camden has some really beautiful parks and public spaces. You know, the Camley Street Nature Reserve is beautiful. I'm hoping that with the new development on Camley Street, they'll be looking at parks and green spaces there as well. But it is quite difficult to reclaim. I think so. The other thing I wanted to mention as well is that you know, talking about the planting, and there's been a lot of conversations recently about things like botanical sexism and how local authorities or governments are looking to only introduce trees that are of the male variety because they don't drop fruit, and therefore you don't have to pay people lots of money to clean up the fruit underneath the trees, and because of that the air pollution goes up because of all the pollen in the air. So you know, I think that being very committed to looking at the ecosystem as a whole rather than sort of what's more convenient is a direction I'd like to see it go down as well.
Can I just add a quick point on that? I mean, I think I was talking to someone earlier on about the sort of development at King's Cross, you know, and how 30 years ago you would approach that. The way they approached the King's Cross development 30 years ago was relevant to how the world was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Now, if you were starting again, you do it differently.
Mm-hmm.
We're gonna make mistakes on the High Line, just as you know. If New York was starting from scratch, they do it differently now because of the things that you learn. And I think it's quite important that we allow ourselves to learn and you know be mindful to as many things as we can, but accept the fact that we're not going to get all of this right. And in 10, 20 years' time, we'll think, God, why didn't we do that? And that's just part of progress and evolution. And I think rather than kind of wring our hands and get too anxious about that, the important thing is to kind of move forwards. Be as mindful as we can, but don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good either.
I think that's a beautiful note on which to draw our conversation towards a close. We're out of time, but we've learned a lot and we've covered a lot in this session. And it's really encouraging, really positive to hear that a key approach of the Camden High Line is to be kind of self-reflective, to be open to maybe making mistakes along the way. But most of all, it sounds like the vision is one that is really, really seriously committed to making a positive, meaningful impact in the community, for the community, with the community. And that's really great to hear. I've also been enjoying the many ways in which the Camden High Line resonates with what New York has done, but also departs from that and does things differently. And I've really welcomed the reminder from both Jodie and Simon about the local specificity of Camden, how Camden as a community, as a borough is different and special and unique, and some of the edgy creative dimensions of that, which will be kind of captured in the Camden Highline project, and maybe also stimulated and fostered through that park in the sky. So I'm so excited that we had a chance to debate and discuss the Camden Highline, and I'm really grateful to everybody who joined us, to our live audience here in the Bloomsbury Theatre studio, and to our online audience, hundreds of people joining us, hopefully from many parts of the world. But I'm especially grateful to our two guests, Simon Pittkiefly, thank you for joining us, and Jodie Eastwood, thank you so much for joining us remotely. It was great to have you both. Really enjoyed what you said, and lovely to have this event together. So thanks so much, and let's go and explore the Camden Highline when it opens, which will be hopefully, ideally, when?
2024, early 2024.
That's coming soon.
You heard it here first.